Hey everyone. Uh, this is an article from the Trotsky Reappraisal, edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. This article is titled Trotsky and Martov. Trotsky's writings about Martov and the Mensheviks during and after 1917 reveal a great deal about Trotsky himself. They tell us about Trotsky's own inner doubts, Trotsky's efforts to overcome them, and Trotsky's notions of revolutionary leadership. I present the following hypothesis. Trotsky's self-affirmation as a leader issued from his sense that Trotsky had successfully overcome in himself or outgrown those characteristics that consigned Martov to the dustbin of history. Yet his nagging doubts about his fitness as a leader continued to affect his political behavior. Anyone attempting a psychological explanation should offer a general picture of Trotsky's personality, and however sketchily, I propose to do so. Trotsky applied a marginal place in Russian society. Trotsky occupied a marginal place in Russian society as the son of a Jewish farmer. The young Trotsky's sense of not quite belonging in any given community no doubt strengthened the well-studied tendency for many Jews in the intelligentsia to seek a rational cosmopolitan identity. Trotsky made such an identity central to his life plan. Trotsky dedicated himself to internationalism and rejected all parochial identities. I need not dwell on this characteristic, which Isaac Deutscher, among others, has probed so well, but rather will sketch out the sources of some important aspects of Trotsky's personal and political style. First of all, Trotsky's parents sent him to school in Odessa when Trotsky was only 9. Early uprooting from a rural setting to an urban setting and enrollment in St. Paul's School had a number of traumatic aspects. The young boy had to learn city dress and manners. His aunt noted in her brief memoirs that he became so fastidious that he constantly picked lint from his clothing. Worse still, Trotsky discovered that he spoke some sort of jargon. He had to spend a year in a preparatory class. Trotsky's lifelong meticulousness, indeed compulsiveness, about dress and language probably were symptoms of overcompensation for these early deficiencies. More important, Trotsky acquired a nagging sense that he was an imposter, and that, too, created a strong tendency towards overcompensation. To my understanding of this, Trotsky was, really, weird about fucking, swearing and shit like that. Thought it was, horrible. Which is so funny to me. In My Life, the book, Trotsky candidly recounts childhood experiences of weakness, of illness, of physical ineptness, and an adolescent episode of paralyzing indecisiveness. He was exceedingly high-strung. In adulthood, when Trotsky applied Marxian analysis to these and other traits, Trotsky associated them with a Jewish, petty bourgeois and intelligentsia background. But even with the self-confidence conferred by Marxian analysis and Trotsky's own psychological insight, Trotsky could not erase from Trotsky's own psyche the consequences of Trotsky's personal development. The somewhat quixotic case of Trotsky's later political career owes a great deal to Trotsky's overcompensation for his early weaknesses and reaction formations to attitudes and emotions that threatened his positive identity. The defense mechanisms Trotsky used to protect his positive identity produced a certain grandiosity in his self-image and machismo in both his rhetoric and political behavior. All this became especially acute after Trotsky rejected the Mensheviks, who collectively and sometimes individually embodied precisely what Trotsky fought in himself, and joined the Bolsheviks, whose suspicion of Trotsky strengthened Trotsky's sense of impostorship and increased Trotsky's already strong tendency towards overcompensation. The imposter theme runs through Trotsky's autobiography. The first revealing episode occurs when Lev Bronstein, age 9, sets out for his first day of school in Odessa, all decked out in the regalia of St. Paul's Realschule. I don't know what the hell that means. And proudly parading to school, he encounters a street urchin who, quote, stopped, looked me up and down, hawked deeply, and spat on my sleeve. It was as if a lightning bolt had struck from a clear sky and reduced me to ashes. It seemed especially unfathomable that he could spit on this wonderful new uniform, which signified a profound change in my life. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. I have used both a manuscript in the Eastman collection in Lilly Library in Indiana University and Trotsky's later version in his autobiography to produce the version in the text. End footnote. Trotsky, end footnote. Trotsky is not yet punished for impostorship, only for his magnificent appearance and hubris. The story continues. When Trotsky arrives at St. Paul's Yard, the school monitor strips him of his medallion, braid, buckle, and buttons. Preparatory students did not have the privilege of wearing the full regalia. Now Trotsky is punished for his impostorship. His humiliation is complete. When a man of 50 tells a tale of this sort, he reveals not only the trauma inflicted more than 40 years earlier, but perhaps offers clues to his personality. Trotsky signals that he is doomed to be humiliated in other contexts, that he will be resented and punished for later attempts to make, quote, profound changes, end quote, in his life and for putting on the trappings of power. One wonders if Trotsky unconsciously sensed the connection of the above story with another one describing an outing to the opera in Paris in 1903, when Trotsky was still an ally of Lenin on Iskra. Quote, once we decided to take Lenin to the opera, An utterly unmusical reminiscence is always associated in my mind with this visit to the opera. In Paris, Lenin had brought himself a pair of shoes that had turned out to be too tight. As fate would have it, I badly needed a pair of shoes just then. I was given Lenin's, and at first I thought they fitted me perfectly. The trip to the opera was all right. But in the theater I began to have pains. On the way home I suffered agonies, while Lenin twitted me all the more mercilessly because he had gone through the same thing for several hours in those shoes. End quote. Footnote. Trotsky places the incident in 1902. Other sources suggest it occurred in 1903. End footnote. Perhaps this not only signifies identification with Lenin, but suggests that Trotsky should not have attempted to step into Lenin's shoes. Always ambivalent about his heirship to Lenin, Trotsky probably expressed his sense of impostorship as well. Trotsky's anxieties about replacing Lenin surfaced in a number of ways. Trotsky did not want the other Bolsheviks to believe he was, quote, casting dice for Lenin's chasuble. What the hell is that? Chasuble? End quote, as Trotsky put it in his account of his behavior in connection with Lenin's, quote, testament. According to Wikipedia, the chasuble is the outermost liturgical vestment worn by clergy for the celebration of the Eucharist in Western tradition Christian churches, and that use full vestments, primarily in Roman Catholic, Anglican, and Lutheran churches. In the Eastern Orthodox churches and in the Eastern Catholic churches, the equivalent vestment is the phelonium. Quote, the vestment proper to the priest-celebrant at Mass and other sacred actions directly connected with Mass is, unless otherwise indicated, the chasuble, worn over the alb and stole, end quote. That's from the General Instruction of the Roman Missal 337, or maybe it's year 337, I don't fucking know. Like the stole, it is normally of liturgical color of the Mass being celebrated. So that's a chasuble. Back to the text. It is important to recognize the fully conscious, rational, and realistic components in Trotsky's assessment of his position in the party during Lenin's last illness and after his death. However, I hypothesize that an unconscious sense of impostorship affected Trotsky's actions as well. Footnote. The traditional Freudian Oedipal conflict has been used to analyze much of Trotsky's anti-authoritarian behavior and his problems with his own authority and power. See, for example, E. Victor Wolfenstein, The Revolutionary Personality, published in 1967. I'm going to look this book up. According to Google Reads description of Revolutionary Personality, which has the subtitle Lenin, Trotsky, Gandhi by E. Victor Wolfenstein, the book's description is, the author takes as his starting point the idea that men who rebel, despite many differences in character, resemble each other in some fundamental ways. He poses three questions. Why does a man become a revolutionist? What attributes of personality enable him to become an effective revolutionary leader? What psychological attributes enable a man to effect the transition to power? By focusing on the personalities of three important revolutionists, he hypothesized a model of a distinctive, quote, revolutionary personality. Lenin, Trotsky, and Gandhi are discussed in terms of trust, pride, courage, industry, confidence, and drive the values the values that result from the successful management of the problems of the various stages of psychosexual growth. Back to the text and footnote. Some aspects of Trotsky's political behavior issued from the simultaneous working of conscious motives and lucid assessment of Trotsky's position and distortions connected with unconscious defense mechanisms. Trotsky knew very well that he remained an impostor in the eyes of the Bolshevik oligarchs before 1917. The Judas label, often applied to Trotsky by Lenin and the Bolsheviks before 1917, only reinforced Trotsky's anxiety about impostorship. The Judas theme is simply a variation on the theme of impostorship, for one species of impostor falsely professes loyalty. Trotsky felt constrained to be the best Bolshevik, the most loyal Leninist. The nagging anxiety that he might indeed be an impostor forced Trotsky to overcompensate by avoiding, quote, soft positions. In political struggles that evoked his sense of impostorship, he irrationally overcompensated in other ways. His famous, quote, my party, right or wrong, end quote, speech at the 13th Party Congress is a good illustration. But Trotsky also overcompensated by savagely attacking people who had some of the traits that he repudiated himself. This is where Martov enters the picture. Trotsky dedicated one of his typically lapidary, quote, political silhouettes to Martov. It contains some telling remarks and serves well as a starting point. Trotsky pays homage to Martov's gifts as a writer, his political resourcefulness, his penetrating Marxian intellect, his tenacity, but in the end Trotsky assigns a, quote, minus to Martov's contribution to revolutionary history. What traits so overwhelmingly negated Martov's virtues? According to Trotsky, a deficit of courage and will deprived Martov's thought and insight of driving force. Note that Trotsky does not accuse Martov of a lack of personal courage or will. Rather, he singles out Martov's thought as lacking courage and will. The Marxian commitment required a special sort of collaboration between thought and will in order to achieve its completion in revolutionary action. Martov lacked the requisite balance to give his thought, quote, physical force. Slipping into a more ironic tone despite the disclaimer, Trotsky wrote, quote, one can hardly imagine either now or at some future time another socialist political actor exploiting Marxism with such talent to justify divergencies from it and outright betrayals. In this respect, without the slightest irony, perhaps Martov deserves to be called a virtuoso. End quote. Trotsky. With even greater irony, Trotsky noted that alongside Martov, Hilferding, Bauer, Renner, and even Kautsky looked like, quote, awkward apprentices, end quote, when it came to political distortion of Marxism, that is, quote, interpreting Marxism so that passivity, accommodation, and capitulation are the highest forms of uncompromising class struggle, bracket Martov's, and bracket dialectics became the subtlest casuistry, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky credits Martov with, quote, revolutionary instinct, end quote, but then adds that lack of will ruined it. Martov was, quote, stubbornly indecisive, end quote. But as already noted, Trotsky did not have in mind precisely Martov the person. Rather, Trotsky saw in Martov's style of thought and leadership features connecting him with broader political, social, and cultural phenomena. This is in keeping with everything we know about Trotsky's Marxian approach to biography. Footnote. For a good analysis, see Barak Paz's book, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. End footnote. From other writings, it is clear that Trotsky believed that biological factors also came into play during the struggles among revolutionary leaders. More will be said about this later. Here it is important only to establish the key negative features that Trotsky identifies. In addition to lack of will and passivity, Trotsky added the vulgarity and cowardice of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia. At first glance, we find nothing striking here. Trotsky, after all, is describing an intelligent and Menshevik. Martov's traits combine the weaknesses of the intelligentsia with peculiarly Menshevik weaknesses. The intelligentsia's weaknesses include, quote, pliancy, receptivity, sensitivity, feminine features of the psyche, end quote, all of which, quote, trimmed away the physical power of thought, end quote. Trotsky. Menshevik failings were identified by Trotsky in somewhat different terms: Philistinism, Menshevism, the risk-averse mentality of the small shopkeeper, side by side with the hope of becoming, quote, a Rothschild, end quote. The latter trait suggests the association, whether conscious or unconscious, of Menshevism's petty bourgeois features with Jewishness. Trotsky decisively and quite consciously repudiated his own petty bourgeois Jewish background, but this does not preclude an unconscious dimension underlying his attitude towards Jewish revolutionaries, particularly towards their weaknesses. Despite Trotsky's brilliance and insight, Trotsky suffered the fate of most members of oppressed minorities. Trotsky had internalized stereotypes of Jews. Jews were money grubbers and cowards. I think it's safe to say that he deplored in the Menshevik traits that he associated with his own past, and violently rejected the identity of Jews in general and his own negative identity in psychological terms. Footnote. I believe the term, quote, negative identity is Erik Erikson's invention. Wikipedia says Erik Erikson lived from 1902 to 1994. Erik Erikson was an American child psychoanalyst known for his theory on psychological development of human beings. Erik Erikson coined the phrase identity crisis. Despite lacking a university degree, Erickson served as a professor at prominent institutions including Harvard, University of California, Berkeley, and Yale. A review of General Psychology survey published in 2002 ranked Erik Erikson as the 12th most eminent psychologist of the 20th century. Back to the text and footnote. Back to the text. All of this came to the fore when Trotsky passed into the Bolshevik camp. The, quote, Russianness of the Bolsheviks compared to their social democratic opponents is well established. The Bolsheviks, whether Russian or not, showed considerable sensitivity about their political base in the great Russian heartland. Trotsky himself took this into account, particularly in a rather shameless attempt to show that Lenin combined the best traits of the Russian proletarian in music or peasant, an essay appearing in Pravda on the 23rd of April 1920, commemorating Lenin's 50th birthday. It is not necessary to review Trotsky's writings and positions on Jewish nationalism, the Bund, Zionism, or on such matters as pogroms, the Bialys trial, and other incidents involving either world Jewry or the Jews of the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Trotsky showed considerable consistency in his Marxian approach. Like Marx, he believed that historically the socioeconomic position of the Jews had created a special Jewish mentality, and his attacks on the Mensheviks faintly echo Marx's observations about the, quote, Jewish question. Footnote. Kanai Paz, I think, is correct when he writes, quote, Marx's severe anti-Jewish language was not echoed in Trotsky's writings, end quote. However, Kanai Paz is quick to dismiss the possibility that Trotsky suffered from a, quote, Jewish complex. I assume here that Trotsky's language and the associations evoked by it reflect some sort of Jewish complex. It appears a tendency to associate certain negative features with Jewishness. Trotsky reacted against those allegedly Jewish traits irrationally. That is, Trotsky overcompensated. Such complexes are familiar enough. In Trotsky's case, Jewishness was involved, in others, some other minority identification with negative associations. End footnote. Trotsky would neither affirm his own Jewishness nor ignore injustices and atrocities committed against Jews. As a member of a proletarian party in a multinational state and then as a leader of the international movement, Trotsky knew the disadvantages of his background and did everything possible to avoid calling attention to his background. Trotsky thus had to tread a narrow path. Sorry, I keep fucking everything up. All of this was quite conscious and measured, but issues involving self-identity do not so easily yield to conscious control. Trotsky's Marxian approach to the position and mentality of Jews on a socio-psychological map shows in a number of ways in his remarks about Mensheviks and petty bourgeois socialists. It shows in repeated references to Meshchenstvo, to petty shopkeepers, to a, quote, combination of debilitating sobriety and sterile fantasizing, end quote. Aspiring Rothschilds lurked behind the miserly hucksters, the penny-pinching Lavachniki. In one inspired attack on the Mensheviks, Trotsky's agile mind leapt to the image of Sancho Panza, Don Quixote's companion, who, in Trotsky's view, embodied the odd combination of vulgar practicality and romanticism found in Menshevism. Wikipedia says, Sancho Panza is a fictional character in the novel Don Quixote, written by the Spanish author Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra in 1905, Sancho Panza acts as a squire to Don Quixote and provides comments throughout the novel known as Sanchismos that are a combination of broad humor, ironic Spanish proverbs, and earthy wit. Panza in Spanish means belly. Paunch, Italian, pancia, several Italian dialects, panza. Sorry, I don't need to read actually any of that, but yeah, so that's Sancho Panza. You know that Strangler song? You know, whatever happened to Leon Trotsky, but the other line is, whatever happened to Sancho Panza. Anyway, back to the text. To be sure, the use of Sancho Panza hardly suggests a narrow association of Jewishness with the petty bourgeois mentality, but what do all of these associations taken together suggest? Is this merely effervescent rhetoric issuing from Trotsky's effort to sketch a generalized petty bourgeois political calling? To call up Don Quixote's companion is quite suggestive. The calling up of Don Quixote's companion is quite suggestive. Perhaps Trotsky knew Turgenev's essay of 1860, titled Hamlet and Don Quixote, which contained a typology easily applicable to the Russian intelligentsia. Turgenev refers to Ivan Turgenev, and according to Wikipedia, Ivan Turgenev lived from 1818 to 1883. Wow, like Marx. Marx was born in 1819. Now it's 1818, I think. Yeah. And he died in 1883, like Marx. Ivan Turgenev lived from 1818 to 1883. Ivan Turgenev was a Russian novelist, short story writer, poet, playwright, translator, and popularizer of Russian literature in the West. Ivan Turgenev's first major publication, a short story collection titled A Sportsman's Sketches, published in 1852, was a milestone of Russian realism. Ivan Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, published in 1862, is regarded as one of the major works of 19th century fiction. Back to the text. In reality, as in fiction, Turgenev's Rudin, for example, intelligentsia Hamlets often turn into Don Quixotes after reaching to their own indecisiveness and lack of will, their passivity. According to Wikipedia, Rudin is the first novel by Russian realist writer Ivan Turgenev. Turgenev started to work on Rudin in 1855, and it was first published in the literary magazine Sovremennik in 1856. Several changes were made by Turgenev in subsequent editions. Rudin was the first of Turgenev's novels, but already in this work the topic of the superfluous man and his inability to act, which became a major theme of Turgenev's literary work, was explored. Similarly to other Turgenev's novels, the main conflict in Rudin was centered on a love story of the main character and a young but intellectual and self-conscious woman who is contrasted with the main hero. This type of female character became known in literary criticism as Turgenev girl. Back to the text. Reaction formation against passivity led to exaggerated, quixotic action. The Sancho Panza figure is like the petty bourgeois Jewish intelligent, who attaches himself to his equally inept Russian counterpart. Together they produce grandiose, quixotic visions and actions. Is it quixotic? Quixotic visions and actions. I guess I don't know. I'm thinking of it as like pronounced the same way as quixotism. I don't know. And actions. But this cannot hide their Hamletic side, their lack of physical force, their impotence. But Trotsky himself had experienced paralyzing indecisiveness during a phase of his adolescence. Between the spring of 1896 and the late autumn of the same year, Trotsky's lack of willpower led to self-doubt, depression, and severe psychosomatic symptoms. Footnote: see Max Eastman, Leon Trotsky, The Portrait of a Youth. Published in 1925. Back to the text. Where am I? End footnote. However, Trotsky overcame the symptoms precipitated by his struggle with his father over his career, successfully rebelled, and became Trotsky. Footnote: the best efforts to psychoanalyze Trotsky obviously focus on his struggle with his father. I've already cited E. Victor Wolfenstein's The Revolutionary Personality. Another study that deserves mention is based upon Erik Erikson's Stages of Psychosocial Development. Stephen Ungland and Larry Kepler's essay, something in French, on Trotsky in the Review of Contemporary, something like that translates as Review of Modern History. Although I believe both works contain insight into Trotsky's development, my own analysis is somewhat different. Wikipedia says, Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, as articulated in the second half of the 20th century by Erik Erikson, in collaboration with Joan Eriksson, is a comprehensive psychoanalytic theory that identifies a series of 8 stages that a healthy, developing individual should pass through from infancy to late adulthood. According to Erikson's theory, the results from each stage, whether positive or negative, influence the results of succeeding stages. Erikson published a book called Childhood and Society in 1950 that highlighted his research on the 8 stages of psychosocial development. Erikson was originally influenced by Sigmund Freud's psychosexual stages of development. Erikson began by working with Freud's theories specifically, but as he began to dive deeper into biopsychosocial development and how other environmental factors affect human development, he soon progressed past Freud's theories and developed his own ideas. Erik Erikson developed different substantial ways to create a theory about lifespan. Erik Erikson theorized about the nature of personality development as it unfolds from birth through old age or death. Erik Erikson argued that the social experience was valuable throughout our life to each stage that can be recognized by a conflict, specifically as we encounter between the psychological needs and the surroundings of the social environment. Erikson's stage theory characterizes an individual advancing through the 8 life stages as a function of negotiating their biological and socio-cultural forces. The 2 conflicting forces each have a psychosocial crisis, which characterizes the 8 stages. If an individual does indeed successfully reconcile these forces, favoring the first mentioned attribute in the crisis, they emerge from the stage with the corresponding virtue. For example, if an infant enters into the toddler stage, autonomy versus shame and doubt, with more trust than mistrust, they carry the virtue of hope into the remaining life stages. The stage challenges that are not successfully overcome may be expected to return as problems in the future. However, mastery of a stage is not required to advance to the next stage. In one study, subjects show significant development as a result of organized activities. Back to the text and footnote. Trotsky's pride in his achievement, expressed in striking images of self-affirmation in My Life and the History of the Russian Revolution, masked continuing anxieties. In these works, Trotsky ranges himself alongside Martov to the latter's disadvantage. Trotsky repudiates Martov's Hamletism and lack of willpower. For example, in My Life, when describing 1905, Trotsky wrote, quote, "In October, I plunged headlong into the gigantic whirlpool, which in a personal sense was the greatest test of my powers. Decisions had to be made under fire. I can't help noting that those decisions came to me quite obviously, ... Later, I observed with astonishment and a sense of estrangement how every event caught the cleverest of the Mensheviks, Martov, unawares and threw him into confusion. Without thinking about it, there was so little time for self-examination. I organically felt that my years of apprenticeship were over, although not in the sense that I had stopped learning." End quote. End quote. Trotsky, My Life. There is a briefer passage echoing Trotsky's earlier note of self-affirmation alongside criticism of Martov in The History of the Russian Revolution. Trotsky brilliantly makes the point for anyone looking for psychological clues to his positive and negative identities. The following description of Martov comes shortly after Trotsky quotes his own speech at the Second Congress of Soviets in 1917, consigning Martov to the dustbin of history. Quote, "The Hamlet of democratic socialism, Martov would make a step forward when the revolution fell back as in July, but now when the revolution was ready for a lion's leap, Martov would fall back." End quote. Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution. For some reason, Eastman translated lion's leap as tiger's leap. I've corrected this, but the rest of the translation is Eastman's. End footnote. The image of a timid, indecisive Martov alongside a coiled, predatory Trotsky sufficiently makes the point. Trotsky's name, Lev, or Leon, of course, means, quote, lion. More clues to the deeper attitudes underlying Trotsky's self-affirmation and his vehement rejection of Martov appear in Trotsky's notes for his unfinished biography of Lenin. A small section of one of the notebooks is entitled Lenin and Martov. Here Trotsky repeats his admiration for Martov's virtuosity in dialectics, but contrasts Martov's mastery of dialectics with Lenin's. Quote, "Martov's dialectic was a dialectic of derivative processes and limited-scale episodic changes, ... On the contrary, Lenin's dialectic had a massive character. Lenin's thought, ... quote, simplified reality, indeed swept aside the secondary and episodic in order to deal with the basic, ... The Leninist dialectic was a dialectic for the large scale, ... Martov's thought was the thought of a watchmaker in politics." Trotsky's thought worked on the scale of the Dnepr-Rostroy. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. See Trotsky's notebooks, 1933 to 1935. Let me look this book up. See if there's anything. Trotsky's notebooks, 1933 to 1935, writings on Lenin, dialectics, and evolutionism. This piece was translated and edited by Philip Pomper and Yuri Felshtinsky. And the description says, These two notebooks were discovered while Philip Pomper was doing research at Harvard's Russian Center for a book on Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin after the Russian Revolution, and were published by Columbia University for the first time in 1986. They present fascinating new insights into Trotsky's philosophy, politics, and psychology, and this volume is a significant addition to an understanding of his revolutionary career. They shed new light on his relationship to Lenin and Bolshevism, his criticism of dialectics and Darwinian evolutionism, and his reflections of Freudian psychology as he ponders the relationship of the unconscious mind to the philosophical issues surrounding dialectics. The original Russian text of the notebooks, prepared and annotated by Fleshtinsky, is also presented here to make the material available to readers of Russian. Back to the text and footnote. The notion that Martov worked on a limited scale, at the level of thought, suggests more than a personal failing. Petty bourgeois characteristics are called to mind, particularly by the image of the watchmaker, and if the conjectures above are correct, the cluster of associations called up includes physical weakness, reduced masculinity, or indeed effeminacy, and Jewishness. Another clue can be found in Trotsky's essay, Lenin and the Old Iskra, included in the collection published shortly after Lenin's death. There, Trotsky compared Lenin to Axelrod in terms similar to the Lenin-Martov comparison. Trotsky wrote, quote, Axelrod analyzed with the greatest skill the tendencies of the different groupings of the revolutionary intelligentsia. He was a homeopath for pre-revolutionary politics, ... The quantities with which Axelrod worked were always very small. The societies with which he had to do, he would measure with the finest scales. Not without reason did Deutsch consider Axelrod like Spinoza, and not in vain was Spinoza a diamond cutter, a work that requires a magnifying glass. Lenin, on the contrary, looked upon the events and conditions as a whole, and understood how to grasp the social complex in his thought. Axelrod and Spinoza, both Jews, did I say end quote? End quote. Footnote. See Trotsky's Lenin. Published in 1925. End footnote. Axelrod and Spinoza, both Jews, show the same penchant for small scale, albeit painstaking work. The image of the petty bourgeois apothecary or jeweler comes to mind. Maybe you know what an apothecary is, but I don't. Apothecary refers to a person who prepares and sold medicines and drugs. Back to the text. Mensheviks, Jews, Mensheviks, Jews, thought at a petty level and could not rise to the occasion in revolutionary situations because they came from a petty milieu and worked on a petty scale. To be sure, Trotsky's own Jewish comrades in arms, not to speak of Trotsky himself, refuted this notion, but Trotsky always had to fight the stereotype that he had internalized himself. But Trotsky always had to fight the stereotype that Trotsky had internalized himself. Returning to Martov, once again we find in Trotsky's notebook some striking passages reinforcing the above conjectures. Quote, Martov's delicate, fragile thought halted, powerless in the face of major events, ... Martov's intellect, psychology, was feminine. From this issued Martov's letters, a magnificent stream, better than his articles, and his articles are better than his books, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, see Trotsky's Notebooks, 1933 to 1935. End footnote. Clearly, lack of physical force and small-scale activity had feminine associations in Trotsky's mind, as well as petty bourgeois and Jewish ones. Thus, the Jew, the petty bourgeois, the Menshevik failed in their revolutionary undertaking because their thought lacked masculine force and will to power. According to Trotsky's sociology of knowledge, the small scale and impotence of their thought issued from their lack of ties to the broad working class. We thus find a Marxian analysis of dialectic styles and styles of leadership alongside stereotypes of Jews and women. But this also calls to mind some of Trotsky's comments about the Russian intelligentsia cited above. In summary, Martov signified Trotsky's own weakness, Trotsky's negative identity. Sorry, I was seeing if there was like a Wikipedia page for negative identity. Pomper said that Erik Erikson coined the term, coined as a precise term. In summary, Martov signified Trotsky's own weakness, Trotsky's negative identity. Martov represented not only the weak Jew, the kind of Jew Trotsky did not want to be, but also the Hamletic personality, the overly scrupulous, paralyzed intelligentsia figure, trying to put behind him the unmasculine reputation evoked by such terms as, quote, organizational Platonism, end quote. Trotsky had to prove that he, a Jew, former Menshevik and critic of Lenin, was worthy of the, quote, hard Bolsheviks. Trotsky also had to show that he was not a Menshevik in disguise. Martov, the Menshevik and Jew, embodied characteristics that Trotsky had to reject. Trotsky's rejection of Martov and the Mensheviks preceded his conversion to Bolshevism, but surely his former association with them affected the vehemence of his attack upon Martov and his formulation of Martov's traits. A few words should be said as well about Trotsky's positive identity. First of all, when Trotsky juxtaposed Lenin to Martov, Trotsky unconsciously meant Lenin to stand for himself. The reference to Dnepr-Rostroy in the comparison of Lenin's and Martov's dialectical style, of course, evokes Trotsky, who had conceived the project. Trotsky's achievements in 1917 to 21 stood up well in comparison with Lenin's. He too commanded a dialectic of vast scope. Trotsky believed that some people were more suited by nature than others for such visions and for leadership in conditions of real struggle. Reference to Lenin's heredity and Lenin's specific fitness appear in Trotsky's biography of Lenin and in notes for the biography. In notes under the heading, quote, genius, Trotsky wrote, quote, it is an individual anthropological, quote, is it, an individual anthropological phenomenon or a social one, end quote. God, I keep fucking this up. I'm going to have to repeat the whole thing. In notes under the heading, quote, genius, Trotsky wrote, quote, is it an individual anthropological phenomenon or a social phenomenon? It is a combination, the interaction of one with the other. Quote, selection and, quote, exercise, the application of Darwinian terms to the formation of genius, end quote. Trotsky. A striking formulation of Trotsky's sense of his own organic fitness, if not genius, as a leader appears in My Life. Trotsky depicted revolutionary leaders as those who could descend into the revolutionary whirlpool. Plunging into water often symbolizes descent into the unconscious mind in Trotsky's writings, and through fusion with the masses, liberate a vast reservoir of instinctual energy. Without a gift of intuition, one of the few intelligentsia traits prized by Trotsky, and instinctual energy, leaders could not achieve such fusion. Quote, Marxism considers itself to be the conscious expression of an unconscious historical process, ... a process that coincides with its conscious expression only at its very highest points. When the masses with elemental force smash down the doors of social routine and give victorious expression to the deepest needs of historical development. The highest theoretical consciousness of an epoch at such moments merges with the immediate action of the lowest oppressed masses, who are the farthest away from theory. The creative union of consciousness with the unconscious is what we usually call inspiration. Revolution is the violent inspiration of history. Every real writer knows moments of creativity when someone else, stronger than he, guides his hand. Every genuine orator knows minutes when something stronger than he speaks through his lips. This is, quote, inspiration. It issues from the greatest creative tension of all one's powers. The unconscious climbs up from its deep lair and subjects the conscious effort of thought to itself, merging within it in some kind of higher unity. The latent powers of the organism's deepest instincts, the organism's flair, inherited from animal ancestors, all this rose up, smashed down the doors of psychic routine, and together with the highest historico-philosophical generalizations, stood in the service of revolution. Both of these processes, individual and mass, were based on the combination of consciousness with the unconscious, of instinct, the mainspring of will, with the highest forms of generalizing thought. End quote. Trotsky. That's from My Life. Only leaders with the right kind of instinctual equipment were fit to lead in such moments. Lenin and Trotsky possessed the requisite gifts. Martov and the Mensheviks did not. However, it would be dreadfully wrong to infer some sort of biological anti-Semitism at work here. Although not free of the self-hatred stimulated by anti-Semitism, in creating his own positive identity, Trotsky found strong Jews with whom he could identify, not to speak of revolutionary comrades in arms. One hardly need mention Marx. Lassalle was another. Moreover, there is evidence, however slight, that Trotsky believed Lenin to have Jewish ancestry. This he could not say openly. However, in 1926, in the article he wrote on Lenin for the Encyclopedia Britannica, Trotsky mistakenly gave Lenin's mother's maiden name as Berg instead of Blanc, or Blank. Footnote. The original can be found in some Russian book, edited by Fleshtinsky, Benson, and whoever. I have seen the same mistake made on notes in Trotsky's archives. Interestingly, Blank, too, is a Jewish name, and rumors abound that Lenin was indeed Jewish on his mother's side. Currently, Russian nationalists like Valentin Rasputin make use of this rumor to discredit Lenin's revolution. Wikipedia says Valentin Rasputin lived from 1937 to 2015, was a Soviet and Russian writer. Valentin Rasputin was born and lived much of his life in the Irkutsk Oblast in eastern Siberia. Rasputin's works depict rootless urban characters and the fight for survival of centuries-old traditional rural ways of life, addressing complex questions of ethics and spiritual renewal. Spiritual revival. Revival. Back to the text and footnote. Berg is a distinctly Jewish name. Trotsky later corrected his error. Another indirect clue can be found in a curious passage in My Life, claiming that the whites in the Civil War failed to make any headway with anti-Semitic propaganda. Trotsky quoted a White Guard writer to support his case, quote, "A Cossack who came to see us was hurt by someone's taunt that he not only served under but actually fought under the command of a Jew." Trotsky, and retorted with warm conviction, quote, "Nothing of the sort. Trotsky is not a Jew. Trotsky is a fighter. He's ours, ... Russian. It is Lenin who is a communist, a Jew, but Trotsky is ours, ... A fighter, ... Russian, ... Our own," end quote. Trotsky, My Life. The quotation shows that the Cossack was indeed anti-Semitic, but that he had failed to identify Trotsky as a Jew. Unconsciously, it appears, Trotsky wanted to show that he had acquired a reputation as a fighter so far surpassing Lenin's that not he, but Lenin was taken for a Jew. The story, in a sense, also unmasks Lenin. Trotsky is the true fighter, Lenin is the imposter. The thought that Lenin might be partly Jewish even affected Trotsky's positive identification with him, but in an odd, convoluted way. In the end, Trotsky shows both profound self-ambivalence and ambivalence toward Lenin. It shows in the above story and in his own, quote, testament, written a few months before his assassination, in which Lenin and Leninism are nowhere mentioned. Brilliant, gifted, not without psychological insight himself, Trotsky nonetheless showed the psychic wounds of a member of a victim minority, as well as those issuing from his personal development. The defense mechanisms he deployed against his negative identity and sense of impostorship clearly affected his political behavior. Trotsky's portrayals of Martov contain the negative identity associated with Menshevism. The Hamletic aspects of the intelligentsia, Jewishness and his own early weaknesses. The working of defense mechanisms show not only in images associated with Martov, but in grandiose self-portrayals, even if in slightly masked form, such as the, quote, "lion's leap" of the revolution, or in laudatory descriptions of Lenin, which apply equally well to Trotsky. Trotsky's profound self-ambivalence generated both self-repudiation and grandiose expressions of self-affirmation. Unconscious anxieties, as well as rational political calculation, show in Trotsky's relative paralysis and psychosomatic illness during the succession struggle. Trotsky's flight from Hamletism and his sense of impostorship did not fully succeed. His vast achievements during the years of the Revolution and Civil War were bracketed by a career that showed typical intelligentsia features. For the greater part of his tragically foreshortened life, Trotsky acted mainly as a brilliant critic of irrational power. Finally, were Trotsky's self-ambivalence and sense of impostorship sources mainly of strength or weakness? They undoubtedly contributed to Trotsky's vivid style of writing and political action. However, defense mechanisms alone obviously cannot account for human achievement. Without Trotsky's extraordinary gifts, the exaggerated behavior associated with a tendency to overcompensate and reaction formation might have yielded only a blowhard, exhibitionist, Chaplinesque dictator. Together, Trotsky's abundant talents and defense mechanisms produced a memorable corpus of revolutionary journalism, remarkable theoretical forays, brilliant oratory, and a bold style of revolutionary leadership. But even a man as gifted as Trotsky could not escape the consequences of his personal history. He fell to the ruthless process of political selection taking place in the 1920s. and in 1940 to the revenge of another, quote, marginal man with his own complex psychology. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening. I think it's always interesting because especially when you're dealing with like individuals, right? There is a psychological aspect to them. That's not just, just like absolute social determinate. Like it's not just like it can't be explained just by reference to broad social forces, even though the broad social forces are very important in cultivating what an individual becomes. But how that that applies to different people in different positions and isn't uniform. So it's kind of interesting to read like some like a psychological perspective on Trotsky, which I haven't really come across too much of before. Obviously, there's some speculation about motivations and things like that, but this one's a little more, I guess, like more heavy on the psychology than anything I've read about Trotsky. Anyway, thanks for listening.